He spent 27 years locked behind prison bars. But when he walked out, he didn't seek revenge. He rebuilt a nation. Today you'll hear the story of a man who lost everything but never lost himself. And by the end of this video, you'll understand how Nelson Mandela didn't just change South Africa, he changed the meaning of freedom for the entire world. Welcome to Still Rise, the place where we bring you calm, powerful stories of people who rose in silence and changed everything. If you love quiet stories of resilience, growth, and greatness, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more videos like this. Now, let's begin with the story of a man who chose peace over pain, Nelson Mandela. This is part 1 of a journey through Nelson Mandela's silent rise, a story that didn't start in victory, but in chains. He was just a boy sitting in silence watching his father grow weaker by the day. In a small village called Mvezo, surrounded by rivers and red soil, a boy named Raleigh Mandela didn't yet know what freedom meant, but he knew what pain was. His father, a proud tribal chief, was stripped of his title by the white government for refusing to obey. They called it justice. Mandela called it the first betrayal. And when his father died, Mandela learned something deep. Without anyone saying a word, a man who kneels to injustice once will kneel forever. That fire, that quiet rage, didn't burn like a wildfire. It sat in his chest for years, slow, silent, patient. At the missionary school, Mandela wore a Western uniform. He learned British history. He was taught to respect the empire. But every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a black boy dressed in someone else's history, a stranger in his own skin. One day, a teacher gave him a new name. From now on, you are Nelson. Accepted it politely, but something inside him whispered, one day, I'll write my own name in history, and the world will remember it. Mandela didn't become a rebel overnight. First, he learned to read their laws. Then, he watched how they broke their own rules. The city and his awakening. And when he moved to Johannesburg, the mask came off. The city was divided by color. Whites lived above. Blacks were pushed below in every street, every law, every breath. He had two choices, become silent or become dangerous. The decision he chose, a third path, resist calmly, boldly, silently. This was just the beginning. The boy from Mvezo would soon become a lawyer, then a leader, then a prisoner, but never a slave. In part 2, you'll see how Mandela took his first real stand, not with violence, but with something far more dangerous: hope. Previously in part 1, we saw young Nelson Mandela leaving his tribal roots behind, stepping into a world that didn't welcome men like him. But what came next was no ordinary challenge. This is part 2, and it begins not with freedom, but with a deep betrayal. Entering the world of injustice, Nelson Mandela arrived in Johannesburg full of hope. But the city had different plans. He saw black South Africans being pushed into ghettos, denied education, stripped of basic human rights. Every street corner whispered one truth in South Africa: freedom has a color, and it isn't black. But Mandela didn't run. He watched, he listened, and quietly he began to learn the language of resistance. The law that wasn't for everyone. He started working at a law firm. It was rare a black man studying law under white attorneys. But what shocked Mandela most was not what the law said it was, who it protected. He saw how black clients were humiliated in court, how laws were used like weapons, not shields. And that's when Mandela made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. If the law isn't for us, then we must become the law. Meeting Walter Sisulu, the first spark in those early years, Mandela met a man who would change his path forever. Walter Sisulu. Sisulu wasn't loud, he wasn't angry, but he was clear. He believed in organizing, in building, in rising silently. And it was Sisulu who invited Mandela into the ANC African National Congress, a movement born in whispers, growing in shadows. This was Mandela's first real step into organized resistance. The first fight, the Defiance Campaign, the ANC launched what was known as the Defiance Campaign. Thousands of black South Africans deliberately broke apartheid laws peacefully, but publicly. Mandela became one of the campaign's leaders. He traveled, he spoke. He inspired the voiceless not with anger, but with quiet resolve. And slowly the world began to listen. Price of defiance. But change always demands a price. Mandela was arrested, again and again. Police raided his home. His mail was opened. His phone tapped. He had to live two lives. By day, a lawyer, husband, father. By night, a rebel planning for a nation not yet born. And through it all, Mandela never raised a fist. He simply said, "We must lead, even if no one follows." A nation divided, but hope rises. By the late 1950s, the apartheid regime had grown more brutal. Children were shot in protests. Families were evicted. But Mandela kept moving forward. His marriage with Evelyn broke down. His life was in danger. But his purpose had never been clearer. He was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol. And yet, the greatest test of his silence was still ahead. In Part 3, we'll enter the time when Mandela's voice was nearly erased, the years in hiding, the secret travels, betrayal that almost destroyed the movement. But it didn't, because sometimes silence is not the absence of sound. It's the presence of unshakable will. This is Part 3 of a journey through Nelson Mandela's silent rise, a story that didn't start in victory, but in chains. He entered the prison as a number, but inside, behind thick walls and barbed wire, Nelson Mandela found something more powerful than chains. He found his voice. The cell that couldn't break him, arrival at Robben Island. The boat ride was quiet, cold wind, cold faces. In a long stretch of gray sea, in 1964, Nelson Mandela was sent to Robben Island, a maximum security prison off the coast of Cape Town. His new name? Prisoner 466-64th, the 466th prisoner. In the year 1964, the prison cell, the cell was small, a thin mat on a stone floor. No bed, no plumbing, just silence. And the smell of concrete and salt air was designed to break him. But instead it taught him patience, Mandela later said. In the long years of incarceration, I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. Hard labor and isolation each day began early. Breaking rocks in a limestone quarry under the hot sun. Even sunglasses were banned, leaving Mandela with permanent eye damage. They weren't allowed to talk during work, but they found ways to whisper hope. And in the silence, something grew. Secret University of the Struggle Robben Island became more than a prison. It became a university, a place where minds sharpened like blades. Mandela and others taught each other politics, law, philosophy, in whispers and secret notes. They called it the Robben Island University. The prison guards had keys, but they couldn't lock the mind. Letters and family. Mandela was allowed just 2 letters a year. He missed birthdays, funerals, moments he'd never get back. But he never allowed bitterness to consume him. Each letter he wrote was filtered. Each word, carefully chosen, as if every sentence had to carry the weight of a lifetime. Internal battles. Time does strange things in prison. Some men shrink, others lose hope. But Mandela stretched in silence. He began to master his emotions. He forgave, quietly, without the world watching, because he knew someday the world would watch. A quiet leader emerges. The guards began to notice. Even those sent to hate him began to respect him. He spoke calmly, walked tall. He refused to let the system define him. One guard later said, "He made you feel like you were the prisoner and he was free." 18 years. That's how long Mandela stayed in Robben Island. Not as a broken man, but as a man becoming unbreakable. He lost time, but gained something far more powerful. The patience to lead, the strength to forgive, the silence that transforms. This was Part 3 of our Mandela story. If you've made it this far, you know this is not just history. This is a reminder of what one human being can endure and still rise. Part for the unseen battle, Mandela's years in prison. He stepped through the gates of Robben Island like a man marching into darkness. No welcome, no justice, just a small cold cell. It was 1964, and Nelson Mandela was now prisoner number 466-64th. But this isn't the story of a man defeated. This is the story of how one man turned a prison cell into a university, a battlefield, and a beacon of quiet strength. Because while the world outside screamed and raged, Mandela went silent. And in that silence, he built something louder than any war. He built patience. Each morning, Mandela woke before the guards. He made his bed with perfect corners. Not because anyone would see, but because discipline was all he had left. and discipline was the first tool of inner freedom. They gave him no books, no pen. So he wrote speeches in his mind and repeated them silently until they lived in his memory. They gave him no visitors for months, so he learned to listen to the wind and found peace in isolation. They made him break rocks for 8 hours a day, but he wasn't breaking down, he was building up. Other prisoners looked to him, and even the guards slowly began to respect him, because even without a voice, Mandela led. Not with fear, not with anger, but with unshakable presence. Quiet power. One day, a new prisoner whispered, "Why don't you fight them back?" Mandela smiled. "I am," he said, "but not with fists." He started a secret school. They called it University of Robben Island, where inmates became scholars, where pain became knowledge, and hatred slowly turned into purpose. That was Mandela's real weapon: time, discipline, vision. The lesson of this chapter, what they didn't understand, is that prison wasn't Mandela's end. It was his forge. And by the time the world remembered his name again, he wasn't just a prisoner. He was a quiet revolutionary, made not in rallies but in silence. In the next part, you'll see how Mandela's prison years planted the seeds of a movement. A movement that didn't just break chains, it redefined freedom. But to understand that, you must first see what it means to suffer without breaking. That is the real beginning. Stay tuned for Part 5, The World Starts to Listen. Part 5, The World Starts to Listen, Mandela's Triumph Against Time. It had been 27 years. 27 long years in prison, but when the gates of Robben Island finally opened, Mandela didn't emerge as a broken man. He came out as a force of nature. A symbol of something far stronger than the prison walls. His eyes met the world with the wisdom of years spent in silence. His voice, though softer than before, carried the weight of history. Mandela was no longer just a leader of a movement. He was now the movement. As he stepped into the light, the world was waiting. The world had been listening. But it wasn't just listening to a former prisoner. It was listening to the story of a man who had transformed pain into power. It was time to share what he had learned. Building tension, his first speech after his release wasn't a rallying cry. It wasn't full of anger or revenge. Instead, it was simple. We are free, but freedom will require more than just the end of apartheid. His vision wasn't just for his people, it was for the whole of humanity. He had a new enemy now, not the ones who had locked him away, but the hate that had been planted, deeply rooted for so long. Mandela knew that freedom didn't come from a signature or a speech. It came from the hearts of the people, people who had lived under oppression for generations. It would require unity, understanding, and forgiveness. Voice of authority, the first step, was reconciliation. He created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a platform where oppressors and victims alike could speak their truths and heal their wounds. Emotional moment. Mandela, in his wisdom, understood something the world didn't yet grasp. Freedom wasn't just political. It was emotional, spiritual, and cultural. Pivotal scene, one of the most powerful moments in Mandela's journey came when he wore the jersey of the South African rugby team during the 1995 World Cup, a symbol of unity, a moment that transcended sport. It became the world's silent revolution, a moment that said, "We can heal together." The world's response. Mandela's name spread beyond borders, not because of what he had suffered, but because of how he had risen above that suffering. He wasn't a man driven by anger or revenge. He was a man driven by an unshakable belief in reconciliation, a belief in the possibility of peace, in the power of forgiveness. And as South Africa's first black president, he embodied a new dawn, a new hope, and a new world. The man who had been imprisoned in chains now stood at the helm of a nation, not as a ruler, but as a healer. A man who understood that true freedom was not about domination, it was about unity. In the next part of Mandela's story, we'll see the legacy he built, a legacy that lives in the hearts of millions. How his spirit continues to shape South Africa and the world. But first, let's understand the deeper truth. What happens when you make peace your weapon? What happens when you choose forgiveness over bitterness? To find that out, You'll have to stay tuned, because this story is far from over. Stay tuned for Part 6, Mandela's Legacy, More Than Just a Man. If Mandela's story touched your heart, share it. Leave a comment. What does forgiveness mean to you? And don't forget to subscribe to Still Rise, where every story is a journey of growth. Part 6, Years in the Dark. The man who refused to break most men would break in a week. He stayed silent for 27 years. And in that silence, he became unshakable. He was prisoner 466/64, the 466th man to arrive on Robben Island in 1964, a number, not a name. For the world, Nelson Mandela vanished. For the guards, he was a threat. But for the men inside, he became something else, a quiet flame that refused to die. Robben Island was meant to crush souls, thin blankets, hard stone floors. The cold wind from the ocean always whispering, "Give up." They gave him a tiny cell, just 8 feet by 7. No bed, no toilet, only a bucket, and the silence. But Mandela used silence as a weapon. He didn't scream. He studied. They gave him limestone to break his hands. He used it to break ignorance, teaching fellow prisoners, talking politics in whispers during labor. And when they said he couldn't study, he read more. Secretly, 1 page at a time. Outside, the world forgot. Inside, he was building something. Not revenge, but resolve. Each year was the same. Back-breaking labor, letters censored, visits denied. But Mandela kept walking. Some guards mocked him. Others began to respect him. Why? Because he didn't bend. Even in chains, he stood tall. He'd been offered freedom once if he renounced the struggle. He refused. "I am not a free man," he said. "So how can I make a free decision?" That moment wasn't just defiance. It was a lesson. Freedom bought with silence isn't freedom at all. Other prisoners followed him, not because he demanded it, but because he embodied it. They saw what true leadership looked like. Patience, discipline, dignity. He aged. His hair turned gray, his eyes dimmed. But his vision for South Africa burned brighter than ever. From inside a tiny cell, he shifted a continent. Journalists began asking, "Where is Mandela?" The pressure grew. Inside the prison, he remained calm. He spent 18 years on Robben Island. Then they moved him. Pollsmoor Prison, still a prisoner. But now, the walls were thinner, and the world was listening. He began secret talks with the enemy, not for peace, but for understanding. He didn't want power, wanted unity. Mandela believed you cannot truly know a man until you have walked a mile in his shoes. So he walked out of in prison in his enemy's shoes. For 27 years he prepared, not for revenge, but for leadership. A president born behind bars. And then on February 11th, 1990, he walked out. But that's Part 7. If Mandela's quiet strength inspired you. Don't forget to like, comment your favorite moment, subscribe to Still Rise. Part 7 is where he steps into a free world, but the real test begins. Part 7, Mandela's secret talks begin in the silence of his cell. Nelson Mandela began to hear something unexpected. Not the cries of despair, but the whispers of a new possibility. 27 years in prison, and now secret meetings with the very men who put him there. This wasn't betrayal, this was strategy. In this part of Mandela's journey, the enemy and the prisoner sat face to face, and history started to shift quietly. Mandela's secret talks begin. The year was 1985. The South African government was facing rising unrest, global sanctions, and internal chaos. And in a quiet, almost unthinkable move, they reached out to the very man they imprisoned for life, Nelson Mandela. Inside Pollsmoor Prison, Mandela received a quiet proposal. Would he be willing to talk? He did something extraordinary. Instead of rejecting it in anger, he paused and listened. "You negotiate with your enemies," Mandela would later say, "not with your friends." The secret meetings began, quietly, privately. No media, no supporters, no movement, just a prisoner in the apartheid regime talking across a table for the first time. It was dangerous. Many in the ANC didn't even know. Mandela feared being seen as a sellout, but he believed something deeply. Peace doesn't begin in the streets. It begins in the heart, even in a prison. He asked for one condition. Before any agreement could move forward, he must meet with the ANC leadership and get their blessing. The prison gates didn't open, but the walls began to soften. Over the next 3 years, Mandela would sit with government leaders with calm, respect, and an unshakable belief that dignity was more powerful than rage. He wasn't begging. He wasn't bargaining his values. He was building a bridge, brick by brick, in silence. Key message in the darkest rooms. With no camera, no applause, Mandela made one of the bravest moves of his life. He listened. Sometimes the revolution doesn't begin with shouting. Sometimes it begins with a calm voice saying, "Let's talk." This was part 7 of Mandela's silent walk to freedom. In part 8, the talks go public. The world watches, and Mandela takes one step closer to freedom and leadership. There comes a day in every life when everything you've endured leads to a single moment. For Nelson Mandela, that day was February 11th, 1990. He walked out not with anger, not with vengeance, but with grace. 27 years behind bars. And in front of him, a country divided and a world watching. This is not just the story of Mandela's release. It's the story of how a man can suffer in silence and still walk out stronger. Part 8, the day the world changed, the pressure was rising. By 1989, South Africa was crumbling under economic sanctions, international isolation, and unrelenting internal protests. President P.W. Botha resigned, and a new leader took over F.W. de Klerk. Unlike his predecessors, de Klerk saw clearly apartheid was dying, and Mandela was the key to the country's future. Then came the words no one expected. The government has decided to release Mr. Nelson Mandela unconditionally. The date was set, February 11th, 1990. The world held its breath. Cameras lined the gates of Victor Verster prison, supporters gathered by the thousands. And then, after 9,855 days in captivity, Nelson Mandela walked free. He didn't rush. He didn't raise a fist. He simply took the hand of Winnie Mandela, walked forward, and smiled. Mandela's first words that afternoon, standing on the balcony of Cape Town City Hall, Mandela addressed the world not with bitterness, but with purpose. "I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people." He reaffirmed his commitment to peace, but made no mistake. Our struggle is not over, but we are closer to freedom than ever before. The world saw a man who had suffered but never surrendered. A leader who could have demanded revenge but chose reconciliation. Legacy of this moment, Mandela's release was not just the end of his imprisonment. It was the beginning of a new South Africa. But he didn't promise miracles. He knew healing would take years, maybe generations. He didn't seek power. He sought unity. He didn't speak with rage. He spoke with quiet authority. He didn't ask the world to pity him. He asked it to help him rebuild. And now, a message not just about Mandela, but for anyone who has ever been broken and still chose to rise. Mandela walked out of prison with dignity intact, voice steady, and heart open. Because sometimes the loudest power is the man who refuses to break even when everything around him tries to. As I walked out the door toward my freedom, I knew that if I didn't leave my bitterness behind, I'd still be in prison. This was part 8 of Nelson Mandela's silent walk to freedom. It's part 9. We step into the most challenging chapter yet, rebuilding a nation, uniting a people, and becoming the president of a divided country. Part 9, the world watches as Mandela leads. There comes a time when a man doesn't just walk free, he walks into history. February 11th, 1990. Nelson Mandela steps out of Victor Verster prison after 27 years. He doesn't smile at first. He walks slowly, calmly, holding hands with Winnie Mandela. A sea of people is waiting. The world is watching, but Mandela is not angry. He doesn't call for revenge. He calls for peace. "I have fought against white domination," he says, "and I have fought against black domination. I cherish the ideal of a democratic and free society." That moment was not just freedom for Mandela. It was a test of his heart. He had every reason to be bitter, but instead, he chose unity. He chose the hard path, the silent path, the healing path. Part 10, his silent legacy, a lesson for all of us. Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first black president in 1994, but more than a leader, he became a symbol of patience, of peace, power without noise. He ruled with wisdom, not anger. With calm, not chaos. And when his time came to step down, he left quietly. No drama, no desperation, just a man who had done what he came to do. He didn't just change laws, he changed hearts. He didn't shout, he showed. What we learn from this story, greatness is not always loud. Sometimes, it's the man who walks away from revenge who leaves the biggest mark on history. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is the final form of strength. Mandela didn't rise by fighting louder. He rose by standing still when the world was shaking. And that is the kind of strength we all carry within us if we choose it. If Mandela's story moved you like this video, share it with someone who needs hope. And subscribe for more stories of silent greatness, because sometimes the quiet ones change everything. And now, one question for you. Do you think forgiveness is a sign of weakness or real strength? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. And your answer might just change someone else's story.